I know I've had many scalding takes during my time in competitive Pokemon. And I also know that even when my take itself isn't particularly spicy, even, that I can also be very opinionated, passionate, if you're being nice. And thus, it's no surprise that I have been in many a heated argument during my time in competitive Pokemon. But lately, whenever I have been faced with, an opinion I just think is absolutely awful, how can they think this way? How it's so this, that, and the other thing. And as soon as I, move to, my instinctual habit of just I'm stopped in my tracks because a voice rings out in my head, clear as a bell on a windless day, and it tells me there is no band. This is a tape recording. It is all an illusion. And that very dark thought has brought me to this video here today. So, with this video, I am going to tell you my philosophy on the game, and that is where my takes come from. Notice I said takes, not hot takes, because, I also have takes that most everyone will consider very reasonable, like Salamence is very good in advance, So, they are all coming from the same place. And I hope that this is of some use to you, because it's not like it is completely your right, of course, to think whatever opinion I have, like Scald should be banned, or Zapdos is mandatory in GSC, or whatever it is. It's completely your right to think that these are the inane ramblings of a moronic, washed up, angry lunatic. That's absolutely your right. I've been known to be elitist about the skill level of certain players not holding some opinions, which is my right, but, I know it doesn't sit well with some people. But the whole point is that we are playing a competitive game, which is not, my excuse or whatever, but that is why it's actually kind of the whole philosophy summed up, really, in that we're being competitive, so the goal is to be as optimal as possible. And, that's why it kind of accounts for both of my ends of the spectrum, and that sometimes I think, the standards are standard and good and used for a reason, and then, wilder stuff, they're still coming from the same place, which is when you are in a tournament setting and you need to get a win, you are not going to settle for something that's pretty good or decent. It's going to give me, not bad odds at winning. No, you are going to try and use the best of the best of the best of the best. And so I have spent a lot of time over the years in many, many generations trying to figure out, the best way to team build, the best way to play. And that is where it's coming from. And I'll give you an example that might illustrate it in more practical terms. Have you ever seen a tournament game where there was a player who is good? You've seen them demonstrate their skill many, many times. They're very successful, all that jazz. And then in this particular game, they bring a team which just seems uncharacteristically terrible. Or they bring a set that's terrible. Or they make a move that's terrible. Right? Or at least it seems that way. And I know competitive Pokemon can be very surface level in how we respond to it. Both in terms of, it's easy to just dismiss, that's terrible, it's awful, it's not, what were they thinking? This is clearly the worst thing that anyone's ever brought to a tournament, stuff like that. And in a similar vein, a lot of competitive Pokemon arguments are very circular. Everyone has their opinion before the debate begins. So there's not really any progression of ideas because you can be confronted with all the evidence in the world that contradicts your position, and you will steadfastly hang on to it because it's part of your whole, identity, basically. That's happened more times than I could possibly remember. So I'm not trying to convince anyone of any of the positions I have. You are free to think whatever about them. Instead, I am hoping to maybe consider the perspective of someone who thinks differently from you. Wow, it's a life lesson. Crazy how Pokemon helps us with that. Isn't that wacky? What if someone made a video about that? Stay tuned. Yeah, but you see this player who's done something truly terrible and awful, and it's easy to just go, oh yeah, that team sucked, that set sucked, that combination of Pokemon, why ever? That move, what was going on? But I have found, and I am not alone in this, that even if I personally think that team set whatever was just the worst, was there some merit to it? What were they thinking that could be taken positively from it? Are we being fair in our response to it? Because Pokemon is a game of strange circumstances. Sometimes a perfectly good team or Pokemon or set whatever will be made to look bad because of a particular battle, right? And our critical faculties are not always as excellent as we would like. And so it is easy to just jump on it's terrible, clearly. Why didn't it? And I find that it has always helped me greatly when, even if I see someone using a set or whatever that I think is bad, that I then, it sticks with me sometimes. I'm like, man, I thought that team was really bad. That set was really bad. What if I tried it? What if I, saw the positives from it? And that expands my position on the game. And that has helped me a lot over the years. Even if I disagree with the way something is done, then maybe there's something to it. And then the good thing is, if you try it out or you think about it more and then you conclude, no, it's actually terrible, then your position is well thought out. And it's not just an instinctual, yeah, I think this sucks, the end, So yeah, there's a lot of nuance to the game, which is one of the things I, always stress the most. And yeah, so here is my basic position on competitive Pokemon. So this extends to how I believe team building should be done. I'm not opposed to, doing things in different styles, by the way. I think, good players should be able to use different styles, for example. But not all styles are, equally good. For example, I have famously ragged on Gen 3 OU physical offense. I truly think it is absolutely horrible. And I have tried it so many times. I'm like, let me give this a fair shake. And no, I think it is just the worst. So that, for example, this philosophy is for team building, it's for making moves in battle, and it is for tiering. All of them come from the same basic idea, which is that we are in a competitive environment, so our goal is to be as optimal as possible. It's for the goal of winning ourselves, and also for the sake of promoting the better player winning. That is the definition of competitiveness, as far as I'm understanding. Because think about the opposite. What it would be without that. Then you could play out of your mind. You could play incredibly well, and it wouldn't matter because the game just said, haha, no. That's why we take things like baton pass out of the game, because it's so restricting, so strong, so difficult to deal with, that you can just play the best game anyone's ever played, and it's like, nope, never mind, this is too hard to stop. That is why we have clauses, right? So since we have those clauses, we are acknowledging that we are making an effort to facilitate an environment where the better player wins, right? So otherwise let Mega Rayquaza loose, let 6 Mega Rayquazas loose, and just see what happens. So we're striving to achieve some kind of balance in that regard. And in team building and playing, it is the same idea. You want a team, or I want a team that allows me to, I want a metagame, and then I want a team that allows me to play the game, to utilize my own skill to help guide me towards the win as much as possible. I know you can't control everything in Pokemon. You have to accept that at some point. But to maximize the odds. And, good playing should be rewarded with as high odds as possible to winning the game. Right? So that alone, I think, if you really, really contextualize, makes sense for, for whichever, scalding opinion you think I have. but I'll go a little further. So, when you are being as optimal as possible in the team building stage and the playing stage, then some things just don't cut it. Like at the end, and a lot of people have argued with, okay, I'm trying to say 16 things at once at the same time. Let me just simplify by saying there is a reason why in Advanced OU, when the game really, really, really matters, Skarmory usage basically triples. Okay, triples maybe not, but it doubles. The best players, the players who are most in favor of using creativity and going as wild as possible, almost all of them, when they really, really need that win, they go with good old Skarmory, because they know, as much as they can espouse the values of Camerupt or whatever junk, even Camerupt's an extreme example because Camerupt is terrible, unfortunately. But even if they say, oh no, yeah, actually physical offense is good, at the end of the day, what talks is what gets used, and that is Skarm and friends. So that's one example. So I have a tendency to always strive for that kind of optimization in terms of what is being used, because to me, there is no worse feeling than bringing a team that is not equipped to handle insert common OU Pokemon here, and as soon as insert common OU Pokemon here shows up, you are just in such a terrible position because of the team you use. Are you kidding me? No, I hate that feeling. It is so awful when the game is taken out of my hands and I can't play, or I'm not really on even footing. And I know not every matchup is perfectly 50-50. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the extreme examples where simply facing X Pokemon, puts you in a horrible position. That is why I tend to prefer, and this is why a lot of really, really consistent players tend to prefer consistent teams. Teams that might get called boring. I believe Finchinator is the latest poster child for this. ABR gets slapped with that label all the time. Plenty of other players, Soulwind. Yeah, it's boring. Well, it wins, and the goal is to maximize competitiveness. And this is why I'm also in some of my other hot takes that I don't know if I've shared in videos before, are things like tournament formats, which for me are all about increasing the odds of the better player winning. aka rewarding you for your play. Because let's take another example. That feeling of you play You play a perfect game, or what you think is a perfect game, and then your opponent triple crits you, and then T-Bolt paras, full paras you, and then freezes you, and then, hooks up with your girlfriend. All in the space of like 5 turns, right? And because your girlfriend just had a complete lapse in judgment, it was completely uncharacteristic of her. But anyway, you get where I'm going with this. You play that perfect game, then you're like, oh, well, there was nothing I could do, because of that bad luck or whatever. Well, think of wanting to avoid that there was nothing I could do scenario, and you kind of get where I'm going. So like, let's say something like Zapdos being mandatory in GSC. This is not something I say lightly, and I won't just rehash that video, whatever's in it. But when I say Zapdos is mandatory in GSC, I'm saying if you are being as optimal as possible, there is no reason ever not to use Zapdos. Because, and I'll give you a counterexample. It feels so horrible to not bring Zapdos to GSC and think, man, I really wish I had a Zapdos right now, because it is so good against everything. Even when, of course, they know it's coming. You could tell your opponent, hey, I'm bringing Zapdos. Like, okay, what changes about the team? Oh, I was going to bring the Zapdos weak team, but now I'm not. No, it's like, that's my philosophy for things like prep and, team building. And because some people like to go really hard on counter teaming and, oh, I've read my opponent's soul. There's no way they'll bring X threat. Therefore, I will cheat on X threat and achieve a more optimal build, and the reward just isn't worth it, and it fails half the time anyway. They're like, oh, why would you ever bring X threat? And the opponent's just like, IDK, lol. So putting the game in your hands and not relying on the opponent, not relying on your opponent not bringing something that they very feasibly could bring. It extends to in-battle play as well, because I won't rehash my video on prediction and like, oh, you could try to predict your opponent, or you could just try to guarantee. Focus on what you can control, and by focusing on what you can control, obviously this is not 100,000% or anything, but within as much as you can, by optimizing what you can control as best you can, then, well, I guess that's what optimizing means. By optimizing what you can control, that should yield some sort of reward, right? That's the game that we should be hoping to design, and the way that we should be playing the game. And obviously, some people disagree on what's optimal and what's not. So I won't get into the small details of that. Instead, I would just emphasize again, pick whichever opinion of mine you think. So, like, let's say I rag on Gen 5OU a lot, and that one, I'm honestly past really being invested at this point. But let's say there's a lot of stuff about Volcarona and Cloister, and so what's the whole debate about them? Well, the debate is that they disproportionately reward what they are supposed to reward, right? It's like, okay, well, if you get a free turn with Terrakion, for example, you might get a KO. You're not going to be sweeping entire teams just because you get one turn with Terrakion. Whereas if you get one turn with Volcarona, well, I guess the benchmark is if you get one turn with like a Rayquaza or something, then goodbye everything, right? So, it's not everything has to be Rayquaza status. Please don't misrepresent that. But is the reward that Volcarona gives for doing what it does fair? And that's kind of the whole, whether it's tiering, whether it's tournament format, is it fair for, in a best of one, to be at the whim of, the many things that can go badly in a game of Pokemon, And obviously something like best of 3 does not fix that 100%. You are not ever going to get to 100% with anything. The goal is just to, within reason, of course, because we are not machines, within reason, push it as much as we can in that direction. And that's why I believe things like Scald should be banned. And I made a video about that too, obviously. And I believe Zapdos should be mandatory in GSC. And I think, Skarmory teams are clearly the best. And I think, because when you are, a lot of these, how should I describe them? These open-minded opinions, because I'm not advocating for being closed-minded. Please don't hear that the wrong way. But, these open-minded, it's like, oh, no, actually, physical offense, it's pretty decent if you do this, that, and the other. Those same opinions, they tend to disappear under the pressure of needing to win a battle at all costs. And that is kind of the mindset that I'm going at things from. So I think that's basically everything I wanted to say, honestly. I'm happy to elucidate, that was definitely not the best word to use. I'm tired. But I'm happy to expand on it if anyone has any questions in the comments. I would love to hear it because, yeah, the opinions I have, in summation, the opinions I have did not just come to me, in a dream. It's the result of many, and obviously putting a lot of investment into something and working hard at something does not necessarily make an opinion, good necessarily, or, validate it somehow. I'm just giving my background here, so where it's coming from. That's all that's important. Because, like, for example, there are some opinions that are bad. Like, I've seen many great Pokemon players with terrible opinions on stuff. I've seen players who are incredibly successful in DPP, for example, or Oris, or whatever, just have opinions that are so bad about the viability of certain Pokemon or whatever that I almost wonder if they're like playing the same game. I'm like, are we seeing the same things? And then I realize they're understanding it differently, and I do think like part of that has to be like the identity, the relationship you have with the tier. Like, I personally am a lot more invested in the DPP viability rankings than the Oris or viability rankings, for instance. And I'm recalling some instances some years ago where it's like, how did this great player think that Gengar is S rank? Like in DPP, like are we what? Things like that. But yeah, so where I'm coming from is just I've spent a lot of time trying to make my teams, my playing, as optimal as possible. And in doing so, I've discovered that, some Pokemon are just the best. That's kind of how it works. Unfortunately, Elite Four Karen's wisdom does not really apply here. So in Gen 2 OU, you better hope your favorites are Snorlax and Zapdos, and Cloyster for that matter. But, yeah, so that's where I'm coming from. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this kind of thing. And so when I have a take that, I guess some people, or many people, whatever, think it's hot, then that's obviously fair. But it is not coming from nowhere. It is not coming out of an attempt to sensationalize. I'm all about optimizing, the team builder, optimizing the gameplay, and optimizing the tournament format to reflect rewarding team building in the gameplay, because you can have good team building, you can have good gameplay, but best of one will sometimes just do stupid things. So tournament format for that, and for that matter, tiering, because I don't think we should have elements that rip the game out of the player's hands. The game's got to be in the player's hands. That's the most important thing. You got to team build, you got to play, you got to have the game in your hands. You got to have the tournament format to let you have that game in your hands as much as possible. Obviously, even best of 99s would get some person unfairly hacked out, and you have to have a good tier which does not promote nonsense. And obviously there's degrees around this. Like, people used to think, oh, ban Rock Slide in advance. It's like, no, dealing with Rock Slide in advance is part of being good. But obviously there are elements that are just too much. Yeah, and that's why I think, something like Scald is disproportionately rewarding what it gives. Or it bails out, bad play. Things like that. Those are negatives. So I hope I made myself clear with this little summary at the end. Thank you so much for watching/listening. I hope you were entertained by the very silly replays on the screen. For those of you watching, I picked them specifically for their silliness. And that is basically it. Silencio.